We are joined by Andrew L. Urban, author of many excellent books, including one of my favourites, which lives on my bookshelf, Murder by the Prosecution. Andrew, welcome to Spectator TV.
Oh, Alexander, it's a pleasure to be here.
Andrew, we will get to your article about Linda Burney's latest shenanigans in just a moment, but first, I simply cannot walk past the news coming out of South Australia last week. This story was buried by the Easter holidays, but for those who missed it, the Labor government ignored the Voice Department referendum and decided to push ahead with a state version of The Voice. To the tune of millions of dollars, they held an election where both the candidates and the voters were selected by race. Now, this was meant to be a highly anticipated and critical event, and it was so important that only 8.7% of Indigenous voters turned out for it. It was, without question, an abysmal failure, an embarrassment. Andrew, why isn't this plastered over every mainstream publication in Australia?
I'm smirking because it's such a great example of being, what's that saying? A glutton for punishment. This was a glutton for punishment by those who purport to be pursuing the well-being of our Aboriginal cousins. I think it's fantastic that it happened. I'm really glad that it happened because it actually shows everybody the non-existent level of support for the ideas that were embedded in The Voice. Truth-telling is a subject matter that is absolutely full of baggage, or as I say in my piece, it's weaponizing the past. Truth-telling, by saying truth-telling, it's like North Korea saying we're a people's democratic republic. The more you talk about that, the less likely it's to be true. Truth-telling really, in this case, would be, I think, grievance gathering, and I think that's just it. But I'm so glad that they did it because it not only did they do it against the national wish of the people, but South Australia had the highest no vote in the country. I think 64%.
Well, that's true.
So
and Andrew, it was 64% of South Australia's 1.7 million residents who voted no, and 2,619 people voted in the South Australian Voice, which is almost no one. And they elected 46 members of a race-based board, which holds real political power over Parliament. Now, this country now has, thanks to South Australia's Labor Party, a true race-based political system. But you're right, what this has done is shown that what Labor told us was wrong. They can't come and blame the white supremacists of the Conservatives or whatever it is they tried last time because only Indigenous people voted in this. Is it good to have a precedent?
I think so. I think this is great. I think it will dissuade or discourage other states. Victoria, I think, has already got the, the Uruk Commission. But it really it just makes a joke of the whole thing in the sense that it's not representative. I mean, can you honestly claim to be a legitimate representation of your voting base if there's about 20 people who voted for it? I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, well, some people didn't
and
even
actually
receive...
20 is not far off.
Some people didn't even receive a single vote, which means they didn't bother to vote for themselves, which is pretty sad. But look, and also what I find interesting is that the Liberal Party are always the last people to the party, but they have now said, now they know it's unpopular, we will rescind it when we get into Parliament. I mean, finally. But look, it's not only a race-based election that we have to watch out for. The Federal Minister for Indigenous Australians, Linda Burney, hasn't given up on the concept of The Voice either. Now, Miss Burney is going about things with a slightly different way, putting forward some random truth-telling idiocy that she, and I'm from reading your article right, she wants to embed truth-telling in the school curriculum. Andrew, firstly, I'm guessing this definition of truth might differ slightly from what you and I believe it to be.
Yes, I think that's what my earlier comments were referring to in dragging truth-telling into this sort of current political climate after all the things that the no vote has rejected, I think represents another facet, which I regret, and I apologize in advance for saying this, but it does look stupid. I mean, it's sort of like stupid stubborn to keep insisting that we're going to have truth-telling even after the country has said no. It is just the kind of stubborn stupidity that characterizes a lot of the small coterie of very loud activists who are not representing Aboriginal interests at all. It's one of those activist little enclaves. I mean, it's reflected in what we were just talking about, that there's virtually no Aboriginal interest in that kind of race separation. So I think it's both unfortunate and destructive.
Well, I like what you quoted. Yeah, you actually included the Oxford definition of woke truth-telling. So I'm going to repeat it for our viewers who might not be aware of it. And this is what you wrote, quote, recognition or acknowledgement of historical injustices affecting Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people following the colonisation of Australia and re-evaluation of the impact of the discrimination and often violent treatment they have faced since that time. End quote, which honestly sounds like Ms Burney is seeking to codify the nonsense activist rewriting of Australia's history, which has been anything but truthful. Now, I would argue, Andrew, that our kids know less about Australian history today than at any point of time. And they used to take us to old Sydney town, and we used to get to experience what life was like for the colonial settlers. I don't know, do you think that the next generation has lost their history in Australia?
I'm afraid so. I remember visiting old Sydney town myself, and I saw a white man being flogged for his sins and crimes. So, I mean, it was a great place, although I don't think it was a real flogging. But I think you're dead right, and I think this is one of the greatest problems that we face, and that is ignorance. Ignorance allowed to permeate through years at school, so people can't even read and write. And then, as we've seen so many cases of protesters, when they question, they don't actually know what they're protesting about. In this case, I think Aboriginal communities should be alarmed that people like Linda Burney are representing their cause, because they're not going to help. They're just not helping. I think Anthony Dillon, I think it was the other day, wrote a terrific piece in the Oz, which in short, basically he was saying what I've always maintained, so I agree with him, that all Australian children should be treated equally. In fact, all Australians should be treated equally. And if you apply that as a mantra, as the guide rail by which to administer assistance to remote communities, you'll see if it was applied, it would actually help. Not easy to undo 25, 35 years of sit-down money damage, but that really is, I think, the answer. So what Linda Burney is trying to push through, or push down our throats, is totally destructive. It is, as I say, it is weaponizing our colonial past, and it's not right.
One thing that I remember distinctly as a child going to old Sydney town was the poverty of our ancestors. These are people who had enough that they could go to school and get an education, but they are sitting in the literal dirt in schools built from bits of wood on, these tables with chalkboards, and they had nothing. And so it's very hard to tell this narrative of privilege of the white people and the colonials if kids have been to places like old Sydney town and seen how devastating the early years were for everybody. And they used to take us to the quarantine station where thousands of people died waiting to get into the country, and that's been left to rack and ruin as well. We're losing the truth, the real truth-telling of our joint history, and it's sad because without those experiences, our children don't understand what really happened to everybody back then. It was a sad time. It was very difficult for everyone. But your article also pointed out the existence of this Uruk Justice Commission, which was greenlit by Victoria's former Lord and Master, the then Premier Daniel Andrews. Now, this happened in 2020, and no one's ever heard of it, but as you said, it's sort of embedded more of this social justice, Indigenous thing into Victoria. But you use that to make the point about circular arguments that activists tend to use, where they start with what they want to find and then find a way to get back to that point. Now, you also use the example of the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change given to the IPCC. What is this about circular arguments that activists love so much? Is it because their actual argument is devoid of reality that they like to try and prove a foregone conclusion? Why are they using these?
Poverty of evidence in the argument. Excuse me. That's exactly why prosecutions of serious criminal cases where there is no direct evidence, it's all circumstantial, the prosecution often uses circular arguments like the one I quote, because like the IPCC about climate change, if it's built into the very nature of the quest, it's already established as fact. That the mission is accomplished before it starts. You know, in the case of IPCC, man-made climate change is dangerous. Go and find out. Go and give us the proof. So it's already established. I think with as an example, for example, just going back to Linda Burney's truth-telling, I'll give you an example of what I anticipate or what is possible. You know, I'm sure you've heard of the Myall massacre, famous massacre of Aboriginals, unarmed Aboriginals, 1836, I think it was. The truth-telling commission story might end where the colonial settlers, of whom I think there were about 11 or 12, killed the Aboriginals at Myall Creek. Or the story continues is that there were 2 trials held of the settlers afterwards, and 7 of the men were convicted and hanged. And the reason for that to happen was that all the Aborigines were also British subjects because they were part of the Australian colony. And that part of the truth-telling, it changes the whole narrative. And if you tell that story, which is already told, we don't have to discover it, we know it, it's a historical fact, it makes the truth-telling commission rather superfluous.
Yeah, because the truth.
I know, that's just one example.
But the truth was never hidden in the first place. That's the biggest problem. That they're making it out as if it was hidden.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Good point.
Yes, well, Andrew, you quoted a controversial work in your piece called The Case for Colonialism, which begins, and I quote, "The origins of anti-colonial thought were political and ideological. The purpose was not historical accuracy, but contemporaneous advocacy," end quote. And kind of fits with what you were just saying then. Now, I've only got a couple of minutes, but just quickly, do you think that this whole truth-telling thing is going to come to an end? Do you think Australia is heading back toward perhaps genuine truth and a more reconciled position as activism is being, unpicked for what it really is?
Yeah, look, for some time now, I mean, quite a few years, I've been arguing and writing about what's missing in the process of pursuing reconciliation in Australia. And the only thing that's missing is the return of the apologies, the return of the hand outstretched by the contemporary Australian society to the Aboriginal society, for them to acknowledge and accept the apologies that have been given. That would be reconciliation. I don't know. I haven't seen any descriptions of what reconciliation would look like otherwise. To me, that would be it. So that it would not only unite Black and white Australia, it would unite Black Australia, which is currently split between the active belligerent cohort and the rest who didn't vote in Adelaide for their version of the voice.
Well, let's hope our reconciliation starts with the end of these race-divisive referendums, but perhaps they will, because South Australia was a total failure. Look, Andrew, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining us today on Spectator TV.
My very great pleasure. Thank you.